Story 1. When Czechoslovakia separated into the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, I was quite young and had no idea what was going on. Then suddenly, they started teaching us slightly different geography at school. But apart from that and a few bitter remarks from some adults, that was all. What I do remember, though, is that almost all the textbooks we got in school were written in the time of Czechoslovakia, and no one bothered to change them for up-to-date versions. So we were often asked to cross out Czechoslovakia from the text and write Czech Republic above it, or draw a thick line between the Czech and Slovak republics on a map. That was during the first 9 years of school, at least. Otherwise, I think Czechs and Slovaks still have quite the brotherly relationship. For example, there is a huge number of Slovak students in Czech universities who later stay to work. Story 2. My parents lived in Bosnia before the Yugoslavian War. They finished building their family home for them and my siblings, who were babies back then, in 1988 or 1989. Now imagine being forced to move away from your newly built life with 2 young children a year later. I was born in Austria in 1992, and I remember being poor as a child, poor but happy. My mother's educational degrees were not found or accepted in Austria, basically restricting her possible jobs to being a cleaning lady after being the manager of a Yugoslavian market chain. I remember the first time we visited the old house after the war in 1998, I think. I remember seeing the house full of bullet holes, one corner of the house blown away by tank grenades. I remember finding my brother's old toys trampled into the dirt in the front yard. I remember my mother finding an old dress of hers in their former bedroom, hardened by exposure to the elements. I vividly remember her sitting on the stairs in front of the main entrance, silently crying. My point is, it is often not so much about seeing your country break apart, but much rather about seeing the life, dreams, and hopes you left behind rot like the old green velvet dress she loved so much. I didn't expect this to gain so many upvotes. I guess a lot of people have had similar experiences in their own or their relatives' lives and can relate. Thanks a lot for the awards. Story 3. I was born at the end of the Bosnian War in 1995, following the breakup of Yugoslavia around 1992. So I can't remember the breakup, but I remember the post-breakup and post-war years. Having very little money, the city of Sarajevo was extensively bombed, and 95% of buildings either had bullet holes or were torn down. I remember watching German channels like Togo and all the cool toys the German kids had that you couldn't buy in my country at the time. My dad drove a Yugo 55. The bodywork on that car was full of shrapnel holes. He replaced the engine. Later, my dad did the bodywork on the car himself, but he didn't have money for car paint, so he painted it with paint used for mailboxes. No supermarkets, only small stores and markets. Now the country looks and feels like any other European country, but back then it was a whole different story. Story 4, well, Czechoslovakia divided into Czechia and the Slovak Republic, and honestly, it's pretty much the same. The languages are almost identical, and there is pretty much no difference between the two countries, except for the fact that Czechia is bigger and has a slightly better economy. Source: I am from Slovakia. Edit: for everyone asking about the details of the split, please read the article on the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. Story 5. I lived in Moscow before the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics got dissolved. One thing that was jarring in the aftermath was the emergence of a lot of Western chains we previously had no exposure to. I remember going to my first McDonald's in 1991. A funny anecdote I heard is that the service staff had to be trained to act more friendly, like they would in American restaurants. To be fair, it was a stressful and uncertain period. Story 6. I was born just around the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, but I have heard from many people who experienced it that it was very peaceful. Basically, Slovakia wanted their own state because they are a separate nation and their language is different, though we understand each other, and they also were not thrilled that all the political decisions were being made in Prague, so Slovakia was a bit forgotten at times. Our two countries still have very good relationships, and although we make fun of each other, we are buddies. Story 7. We emigrated from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics about a year before it broke up, so technically I'm a Soviet. What makes everything more complicated is that we're from Crimea, which was recently annexed by Russia. I opened a new bank account a while back, and one of the details I had to fill in was where I'm originally from. It was an electronic form with a menu. There was no option to select the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and picking either Ukraine or Russia would be taking a political standpoint. It was a very weird experience. Story 8. I was born in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics 2 months before it collapsed, so I don't personally remember anything, but my parents do. Everything was basically chaos. Most of the businesses that were previously funded by the government had no chance of competing with Western businesses, so many of them went bankrupt, and that meant that lots of people, including my father, lost their jobs. Lots of unemployment then led to lots of crime. The 1990s were a crazy time full of riots, crimes, and violence in many former Soviet countries. Story 9. My husband was born in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, and although he is ambivalent about the positives and negatives of the system, he is still sad to effectively not be able to return to the country he grew up in. Nothing is the same there since the collapse of communism. There is a name for that feeling in Germany: nostalgia. Ost means east in German. Story 10. I was born in Yugoslavia in the mid-1980s. It was sad. I lived in a major city largely untouched by direct attack, but we had all three major ethnicities heavily represented, and it was incredibly confusing as to why friends stopped being friends and families broke up. As kids, we understood what was happening, but not why. I remember hiding my next-door Muslim neighbor when the military police came. I remember being embarrassed about who I was, even though my family lineage had mixed roots. I remember weeks without electricity, without running water, doing homework by candlelight, military rations, and 1 bottle of oil to last months. Flour was scarce. The river would carry sounds of gunfire and explosions. I saw my dad only a few times in 5 years. Afterwards, I remember thinking that was lucky. Some didn't see their dads at all. I remember my dad spending what little time he had at home teaching me how to use various guns. Just in case. Afterwards, some people lost their minds. One of the soldiers was convinced the enemy was still there, ever present. He would place small explosives that looked like canned food in the cupboards where his wife and kids were, in his mind, to protect them. A couple drank themselves to death. I always believed they died in the forest outside the town years ago. Businesses closed. Factories were empty. There was still work for some, but no pay. The currency was worthless. You'd get paid sometimes in the morning, and by the afternoon, it wasn't even enough for a roll of toilet paper. Weird, scary times. Air raid sirens would interrupt soccer games. I remember wondering why I couldn't see some of my friends. Explanations back then didn't make sense. They still don't. For the people that lived, worked, and played together, we never wanted that. It was pushed on us, manipulated us, played to our fears and insecurities. Maybe it would have happened eventually regardless. Story 11. Breaking Czechia from Slovakia wasn't a big deal. In the shadow of the fall of communism. One day they were simply gone like a lover in the morning, and that was all right. Story 12. I was born and still live in one of the former Yugoslav republics, Slovenia. I was 3 months old when we declared independence, so I don't remember how the country's fragmented, but I do remember the Bosnian War and the influx of refugees, although I didn't really understand it as a kid. The thing that personally affected me the most about the dissolution of Yugoslavia was the constantly shifting maps. Every year in school, we had new maps, and each one was different when you looked at the area of Serbia. The reason I'm writing this is because the whole Yugoslav past still has far-reaching consequences in our lives, mainly in the political spheres. Many politicians who were around at the time of the breakup are still active, and the people are harshly divided about the Yugoslav past of the country. Some suffered during the socialist era and some prospered. Some see it as a great time, and some view it as this horrible oppressive regime. It's especially bad when the time immediately after World War II is brought up because that was the time of, well, changes and horrible actions from the new government side. And naturally, the politicians try to appeal to one of those groups. It has come to the point where these types of things eclipse every actual problem in the country. Are there issues with our public health care? Well, who cares? The opposition to the reforms are communists, and suddenly that's what everyone talks about. Are there issues with taxing the independent workers? Sure, but have you heard about a statue that was unveiled for victims of after-war killings? That's what we should talk about. Every single issue is swept away by just shifting the focus to something that happened in the time of Yugoslavia, and who did what and who deserves to be punished, and people who actually lived through those times just absorb it. Especially the older generations because they were directly impacted by the end of the war. Story 13 doesn't exactly answer the question, but the breakup of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union affected capitalist countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain as well. We had a massive recession in Finland during the early 1990s, since the Soviet Union was an important business partner during the Cold War and now it was gone. Story 14. So my story is like a breakup that didn't happen, but some 55 years later, it's still bitter. The Maldives is made up of small islands in the Indian Ocean that no one knew about, especially back then, because there was no tourism. We are made up of many atolls. An atoll is a group of islands. In our case, it's about 200 small islands on average in an atoll. All the atolls are scattered. Interestingly, atoll is from the Maldivian word athalu. Anyways, after the British left us, there was tension between the three southernmost atolls and the rest of the country. The South was economically prospering but didn't want to pay taxes to the government. The British armed the Southerners, but the South didn't want to take arms against their brothers. They made a Republic of Suvadives. The government heard about it, and there was a lot of tension but no civil war. People were displaced, and the main island, which was the economic capital, got ransacked. That's where my grandmother is from. Recently, I went there for work and told them I'm her grandson. So people welcomed me as their own. It's like everyone has a lot to say against the people from the capital. There's still hostility in their minds, but the times have changed. A majority of the people live in Male, the capital. However, they still really want independence. On another note, documents from the British Foreign Ministry show that their intention was to make a British military base in the south. Since they couldn't do it, they did it to our neighbors in Diego Garcia. Pretty much a takeover. They sent the people to a different country on boats, and they still live in poverty. On top of that, the island was sold to the American army. So it's good we didn't get split and they didn't get annexed. Story 15. My country still exists, but it's not the same as before the revolution. People carried out the revolution only to harm themselves. Poor people are still poor, and the more flattering and religious you are, the better position you get. Can you guess where I am from? Story 16. I was born in the Soviet Union in 1982, in Ukraine. The breakup itself was not a big deal, actually. There were little patriotic feelings of the great country to mourn about. The change from planned communist mode was disastrous, true, but that is a separate thing from the breakup. I was small, but my parents were like, nah, whatever about the breakup, having more concerns about the economic change. I think their reasoning was that federalization or less centralization of power was somewhat a good thing, but not a big deal. Story 17. I am from North Macedonia, and we didn't have that many problems breaking up. Even though we didn't participate in the war, my father was in the Yugoslav People's Army, Serbian military, and fighting on their side. Many Macedonians were sent to the war, but luckily my father fled from Serbia, and he didn't see the tragic ending. Story 18. I was born in Romania in 1996, so way after the collapse of communism. Even though Romania always was its own nation, it was also just a Soviet satellite state, so the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics always had influence over there. Anyhow, my mother told me many stories about her time growing up before the collapse and what happened during and after. When she reminisces, she's always telling a positive story, saying good things about her upbringing and way of life. But of course, after the collapse, everything went bad immediately. Comparing my childhood to the way things are now, however, things are much better. People flocked out of the country in search of a stable home since they were finally allowed to travel freely, and you can imagine how that alone inhibited the rate at which the country could grow and prosper. But yes, things were crazy. People became more bitter since everyone was fighting for scraps, and politicians were trying to establish a new government for the first time in decades. Corruption never left because it was a Soviet way of life, and they accepted things to remain the same. Until now, the damage still exists, but luckily the country has improved significantly, especially after our ascension into the European Union. Last year, when HBO released the limited series Chernobyl, I decided to watch it with my mother. She became incredibly nostalgic and shed some tears because I believe, for the first time in a long time, she started to clearly see the faults of the way of life in communist Eastern Europe. Everything from the atmosphere to the way of life, to the corruption, to the behavior, all touched a long-lost part of her upbringing.